morning Edmund Ashford decided his wife was no longer useful to him, he did it quietly, the way he did everything that mattered. He did not shout. He did not argue. He simply poured himself a glass of brandy, stood at the tall window of his study, and watched Allara walk through the rose garden below, with a small smile on her face, and a basket of cut flowers on her arm, and he made a decision. That was how Edmund worked. Cold, calculated, entirely without feeling. He was the 5th Duke of Windermere, a title that carried with it 3,000 acres of English countryside, a crumbling but magnificent estate called Ashford Hall in rural Gloucestershire, a seat in the House of Lords that he rarely used, and debts so enormous they had begun to eat through his fortune the way damp eats through plaster, silently, steadily, and without mercy. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray already threading through his dark hair at the temples, and a face that people often described as handsome in a cold way, the way a marble statue is handsome. His eyes were pale gray. They gave nothing away. In all the years that his staff had worked for him, the footmen, the grooms, the groundskeepers, not one of them had ever claimed to have seen Edmund Ashford truly laugh. They had seen him smile, yes, a thin, controlled thing that moved only the corners of his mouth. But laugh? No, never. He had married Allara Belmont 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1884. The marriage had been arranged, as most marriages in his circle were, with the efficiency of a business transaction. The Belmonts were a wealthy family from Wiltshire, not titled but solid, prosperous, and possessed of a fortune built on good land and sensible investments. Allara's father, Mr. George Belmont, had been enormously pleased. His daughter would be a duchess. What more could a man want? What George Belmont had not considered, or perhaps had chosen not to consider, was the particular quality of the man his daughter was marrying. Allara had been 23 when they wed. She was now 26, and the 3 years between those two ages had taught her things she had not expected to learn quite so soon. She had learned, for instance, that a house could be enormous and still feel like a cage. She had learned that a man who never raises his voice can still be terrifying. She had learned that silence, used correctly, can be the most effective weapon in the world. But she had not broken. That was the thing about Allara that Edmund had fundamentally failed to understand when he had looked her over at their first meeting and decided she would suit his purposes. She had a spine of quiet iron. She smiled at the servants by name. She remembered birthdays. She sat with the estate's tenants when they were ill and sent food baskets at Christmas without being asked. The people of Ashford Hall loved her in a way they would never love him, and Edmund, who noticed everything, had noticed this too. It bothered him more than he let show. The woman who managed the household, Mrs. Agnes Crane, who had worked at Ashford Hall for 22 years and who had known 3 generations of Ashfords, had watched the marriage with the careful, worried eyes of someone who understands exactly what they are seeing but cannot yet prove it. Agnes Crane was 60 years old, stout, with white hair pinned under a housekeeper's cap and hands that were always busy. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had managed this house through floods, through a fire in the East Wing, through the death of Edmund's father, and through the spectacularly disastrous dinner party at which a visiting earl had collapsed face first into the soup. But Edmund Ashford frightened her. Not because he was cruel in any obvious way. He was not. He simply looked at people as if he were calculating their weight on a scale and finding them slightly wanting. And the way he looked at Allara had changed, Agnes had noticed, in the last year. It had shifted from the cold indifference of a man who has lost interest in a possession to something more focused, more deliberate. It was the look of a man who has decided what to do next and is merely waiting for the right moment. Agnes had no words for what she felt when she saw it, but her stomach turned, quietly and persistently, every time Edmund and Allara were in the same room. Allara herself did not see it, or perhaps she saw it and refused to be frightened by it, because she was Allara, and fear was not something she permitted herself to show. She moved through Ashford Hall with her chin up and her eyes clear, spending her days in the gardens she loved, reading in the library, writing long letters to her younger sister, Cesily, who was 22, and bright, and sharp as a new pin, and who wrote back letters that made Allara laugh out loud, in a way that no other person in that house could manage. Cecily's letters were the best part of Allara's week. "Tell me you are happy," Cesily wrote, in a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 1887, when the trees on the estate had gone amber and gold and the air had the first cold edge of winter in it. "Tell me Edmund is learning to be a human being. Tell me you have taught the horse to waltz. Tell me something wonderful, because I am sitting in Father's drawing room listening to him talk about drainage systems and I need something to hold on to." Allara sat at her writing desk and read the letter twice, and smiled, and then picked up her pen. She wrote back, The horse is showing no talent for dancing whatsoever. Edmund is precisely as he has always been. The roses have been spectacular this year. I miss you every single day." She did not write what she was thinking, which was that something had changed in the house. Something she could not quite name but could feel the way you feel, a change in weather before the clouds arrive, a pressure in the air, a stillness that is not peaceful. She sealed the letter and sent it with the morning post and went back to her garden. 2 weeks later she fell ill. It came on fast, the way illness sometimes does when it has a mind of its own. One evening she was perfectly well, eating supper, listening to Edmund talk about estate business with the blank expression she had perfected over 3 years of dinners. The next morning she woke with a fever and a pain in her throat and a heaviness in her limbs that made even sitting up in bed feel like climbing a mountain. Edmund summoned Dr. Harwell that same morning. Dr. Philip Harwell was the estate physician, a thin, neatly dressed man in his 50s with a careful manner and a habit of not quite meeting people's eyes. He had served the Ashford estate for 8 years. He was, in every visible way, professional and competent. Agnes Crane did not like him, though she could not have said precisely why. He was polite to her. He answered questions clearly. He simply made her uneasy in the same vague, persistent way that a door left slightly open in a locked house makes you uneasy. Dr. Harwell examined Allara for perhaps 20 minutes. He asked her several questions. He took her temperature. He looked at her throat. Then he came out of her bedroom and spoke to Edmund in the corridor, his voice low, and Agnes, who was passing with a tray, heard the word fever and the word serious, and then the two men moved away down the hall and their voices dropped further. Agnes set the tray down outside Allara's door and stood very still for a moment. She did not know why the hairs on the back of her neck were standing up. She knew only that they were. She went into Allara's room with the tray, warm broth, a pot of tea, a small bunch of late-season flowers from the garden that Agnes had cut herself because she thought Allara would like them. Allara was lying against the pillows with her eyes half closed, her face flushed with fever but still unmistakably beautiful, in the way that some faces are no matter what they go through. "Mrs. Crane," Allara said, and her voice was hoarser than Agnes had ever heard it. "Don't talk, my lady," Agnes said. "Just rest." Allara's eyes opened more fully. They found Agnes's face with a clarity that surprised her, given how ill the young woman so clearly was. "Has he sent word to my father?" Allara asked. "I'm sure he will, my lady." Allara held her gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked away, at the window, at the gray October sky beyond it. "Good," she said, but she said it in the voice of someone who is not entirely sure they believe what they are saying. Agnes brought the broth to the bedside. She poured the tea. She arranged the flowers in the small vase on the windowsill, and when she left the room she closed the door behind her with the careful, deliberate softness of someone who is trying very hard to look as though everything is perfectly normal. Then she went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and looked out at the garden for a long time without seeing it. Dr. Harwell came every day. He brought medicines, small bottles of things that he administered himself, which was not, Agnes thought, entirely usual. Most physicians left instructions for the household staff to follow. Dr. Harwell preferred to administer Allara's medicines personally. He was very particular about this. Within 4 days, Allara was no longer able to sit up in bed. Within 6 days, she was barely conscious. Agnes was not permitted to nurse her. Edmund had engaged 2 women from the village, women Agnes did not know, who had no prior connection to the estate, to attend the Duchess around the clock. They were not unkind, they were simply strangers, and they followed Dr. Harwell's instructions precisely and asked no questions. Agnes tried, 3 times, to send a private message to the Belmont family in Wiltshire. The first time, she asked one of the footmen to post the letter for her. He came back an hour later and said, awkwardly, that Mr. Croft, the Duke's personal secretary, had asked him to hand all outgoing correspondence through the main office for the time being, due to the disruption of the household. Agnes wrote the letter a second time and walked to the village herself to post it. She was met, outside the post office, by Mr. Croft, who was a small, humorless man with the specific obedience of someone who has learned that asking questions is bad for his position. He told her, with great politeness and great firmness, that the Duke had asked that no independent correspondence be sent during the Duchess's illness to avoid causing unnecessary alarm to the family. Agnes went back to the hall with a face like stone. She wrote the letter a 3rd time and tucked it inside her dress. She never found the right moment to send it. Later, she would think about that, the specific architecture of those days, the way every moment was slightly too watched, too managed, full of the quiet machinery of a house that was being controlled down to its smallest detail. She would think about it for years. On the 8th day, Dr. Harwell came out of Allara's room with a face arranged into an expression of professional sorrow. He found Edmund in the study. Agnes was in the hallway, polishing a silver candlestick that had been perfectly clean for 3 days. She heard Edmund say, "When?" She heard Dr. Harwell say, "Early this morning, Your Grace," peacefully. And she heard Edmund say, "Very well. Begin the arrangements." Agnes set down the candlestick. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. She had thought they would shake. Instead, they were perfectly still and cold, and she stood in the hallway of the house she had worked in for 22 years and looked at the closed door of the study and felt something settle in her chest, like a stone dropping to the bottom of a deep, dark well. She did not believe it. She could not have told you exactly why she did not believe it, only that she did not, only that the whole 8 days had had the texture of something constructed rather than something real. Only that the specific arrangement of events, the unknown nurses, the private medicines, the blocked letters, the closed door, had the feeling not of grief but of management. She went about her duties that day the way she went about everything, steadily, quietly, with her face giving nothing away. But that night, alone in her room, she took the unsent letter out from where she had folded it inside her apron and she read it over once. Then she lit a candle and held the letter over the flame and watched it burn. Because she was not a fool. She knew what happened to servants who asked the wrong questions in houses like this one. She knew what Edmund Ashford was capable of, and she had not survived 22 years of service by being reckless. But she did not stop thinking. The funeral was announced for 3 days later. Sealed casket. Private ceremony. Invitation only. And Agnes Crane went to sleep that night with the letters ash in the fireplace, and a question she could not stop turning over in her mind. A question that kept her awake long after the clock in the hallway struck midnight. Long after the whole house went quiet around her, long after the candle burned itself down to nothing. The question was simple. If Allara was gone, why did Agnes not feel it? She had been at this house through 3 deaths. She had felt each one. The way the air in a house changes when someone who lived in it is truly gone, that particular, unmistakable hollowness. The house did not feel hollow. It felt like it was holding its breath. Agnes pulled the blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling in the dark, and thought about a young woman with a basket of flowers and a smile that the whole estate loved, and she thought, something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong, and there was nothing she could do about it. Not yet. Edmund Ashford had not made this decision in a single night. That was important to understand about him. He was not the kind of man who acted on impulse. Everything he had done in the 8 days of Allara's supposed illness had been planned with the same cold patience he applied to estate business, to investments, to the management of his debts. He had simply applied that patience to his wife. He had met Dr. Harwell in London 6 months earlier at a private dining club that catered to men of a certain kind, men with money problems they did not wish to discuss in ordinary company. They had spoken carefully, over 2 very good bottles of wine and a dinner neither of them tasted. Edmund had laid out his situation with the precision of a man reading a legal document. His debts, their scale, the impossibility of addressing them through ordinary means, and the particular obstacle that stood between him and the solution he had in mind. The obstacle was Allara. Allara's fortune, the portion of the Belmont money that had come to her through the marriage settlement, was tied up in a legal arrangement that would revert, in the event of her death, directly back to the Belmont family. Edmund got none of it. What Edmund needed was not Allara's death but Allara's disappearance from his life, quietly and completely, in a form that the law would recognize as final. Dr. Harwell had listened with his careful face arranged into its careful expression. Then he had said that he knew of a private medical establishment in France, a discreet place, well run, experienced in the management of ladies whose mental fragility or social difficulty required, as he put it, a period of extended therapeutic care away from their ordinary circumstances. Edmund had looked at him across the table and said, "What would it cost?" Dr. Harwell had told him. Edmund had picked up his wine glass, turned it once in his fingers and said, "Arrange it." And it had been arranged. The illness had been real enough. Edmund had made sure of that, with something introduced into Allara's evening tea that Dr. Harwell had provided. Not enough to cause serious harm, just enough to produce a genuine fever, a genuine decline, genuine symptoms that any examining physician would recognize. He had not wanted to hurt her more than was necessary. He was not, he told himself, a cruel man. He simply needed the situation managed. The 2 women brought in to nurse Allara were Dr. Harwell's people. They had done this kind of thing before. They administered the medications that kept Allara sedated and compliant. They ensured no one from outside had access to her. On the 8th morning, while the household was still at breakfast, Allara, sedated, wrapped in plain traveling clothes, barely conscious but breathing steadily, had been placed in a covered carriage that left through the estate's rear gate. She had been taken to Dover, then to Calais, then to Lyon. The coffin that was buried 3 days later in the churchyard of St. Crispin's Chapel on the Ashford grounds contained, as several of the servants privately noted to one another in hushed voices over the following weeks, no one at all. What was inside it, sealed with impressive solemnity by men Edmund had hired from outside the county, was a carefully weighted arrangement of material that would satisfy any casual inspection without the necessity of the casket ever being opened. Edmund had been thorough. He was always thorough. What he had not been thorough enough about was Cesily Belmont. The Belmont family received the telegram announcing Allara's death on the same morning it was sent, a Tuesday, cold and overcast, with rain threatening on the horizon. George Belmont, who was 60 and not in the best of health, had to be helped to a chair. His wife, Margaret, wept in a way that she had not wept since her own mother died. The servants of the Belmont house moved quietly and carefully around the family's grief, the way servants do. Cesily Belmont did not weep. She sat very still in the corner of the room for a long time, with the telegram in her hands, reading it over and over. It was a short message. It said that the Duchess had passed from scarlet fever following a rapid illness, that the burial would be private at the family chapel on the estate, and that the Duke expressed his profound sorrow and his deepest sympathies to the Belmont family. Cesily read those words perhaps 8 times. Then she folded the telegram with precise, deliberate movements and put it in the pocket of her dress. She was 22 years old and she was the sharper of the 2 Belmont sisters, though she would never have said this aloud, because she loved Allara too much to reduce their relationship to a comparison. But she was sharp. She had a mind like a well-kept knife, clean and precise and very good at cutting through to the point of a thing. The point of this thing, she thought, was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. She had received a letter from Allara 11 days ago. 11 days. In that letter, Allara had mentioned feeling slightly tired, but had attributed it to the change in season. She had written 3 pages about the garden, 2 paragraphs about a book she was reading, and a long, funny description of an incident involving the stable cat and the butler's best hat. She had written nothing about illness. She had written nothing about feeling unwell in any serious way. People did not go from slightly tired to dead of scarlet fever in 11 days. Cesily knew this because she had read everything she could find about medicine after a cousin of hers had died young, and she had wanted to understand why. Scarlet fever was serious, yes, it could be dangerous, but it was not an 11-day illness in a healthy 26-year-old woman. Also, there had been no access, no visit allowed. No one from the family had been permitted to see Allara during her illness, or to see the body afterward. The sealed casket had been explained away as a precaution against contagion. The private burial had been explained as the Duke's preference. Every explanation was logical on its surface, and collectively they added up to something that made Cesily feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She went to her father that evening. He was sitting in his study with a glass of something untouched in his hand, looking at nothing. "Father," she said, "I want to go to Ashford Hall." He looked at her. His face was exhausted and old in a way she had not seen before. "For the funeral," she said. "I want to see her." "The Duke says," her father began. "I know what the Duke says," Cesily said quietly. "I want to go anyway." George Belmont was not a man who refused his daughters things, particularly when they asked in that particular tone of voice, the voice that was calm and reasonable on the surface, and absolutely inflexible underneath. He wrote to Edmund that evening requesting that the family be permitted to attend. Edmund's solicitor replied within 2 days. The reply was courteous, regretful, and entirely firm. The burial had already taken place. The Duke was prostrate with grief and not receiving visitors. The family's well-being was of course his first concern. He would be in touch when circumstances permitted. Cesily read the solicitor's letter standing at the window of her bedroom in the morning light. Then she went to her writing desk and began to write letters of her own. She wrote to Agnes Crane first, because Allara had mentioned Agnes many times in her letters, always with warmth, always with a note of quiet trust. Mrs. Crane was the person Allara relied on in that house. If anyone knew what had truly happened, it would be Agnes. The letter came back unopened 10 days later, with a note from Edmund's secretary saying that Mrs. Crane was unavailable for personal correspondence at this time. Cesily wrote again. The second letter also came back. She wrote to one of the footmen whose name she had learned from Allara's letters, a young man called Peter who had, apparently, been genuinely kind to Allara when she had twisted her ankle in the garden the previous spring. That letter also came back. She wrote to the village doctor in the nearest town, asking whether he had been consulted during the Duchess's illness. He wrote back a brief, polite note saying that Dr. Harwell, the estate physician, had managed the case entirely and that he himself had had no involvement. She wrote to a friend of her father's who had connections in the legal world, asking, in the most careful possible language, whether there were any avenues through which the family might formally request information about the circumstances of her sister's death. The friend wrote back with sympathy and with the information that, absent specific evidence of wrongdoing, the family had limited formal avenues. He advised patience. Cesily folded that letter neatly and set it aside. She was not good at patience, but she was very good at method. She began keeping a notebook. In it she wrote down everything. Every date, every letter, every response or non-response, every detail from Allara's correspondence that she had saved, every fact about scarlet fever she could gather from the books in her father's library, and from the medical journals she borrowed from the local lending library. She wrote in small, clear handwriting, filling the pages with an orderliness that was almost mathematical. She also began thinking about where a person might go if a person needed to disappear. Not because she was certain, she had no proof. She had only the things that did not add up, and the cold knowledge of her sister's handwriting in that last letter. Bright, clear, ordinary, and the absence of any word from anyone inside Ashford Hall, and the particular, deliberate way every door had been closed before she could get her foot in it. She was not certain. But she was paying attention. And in the village near Ashford Hall, in the modest cottage she had retired to after leaving her position at the estate, because she had, in the end, found her position at the estate untenable, and had left quietly and quickly on the advice of no one except her own good sense, Agnes Crane was also paying attention. Agnes had left Ashford Hall 3 weeks after the funeral. She had given the excuse of her age, her health, a desire to be closer to her sister in the next village. These were all partly true. What was entirely true was that she could no longer remain in that house and look at Edmund Ashford across the breakfast room without the thought occurring to her that she was looking at a man who had done something she could not name but could not stop believing in. She had left. She had taken nothing that was not hers. She had said nothing to anyone about what she thought. But she had taken one small thing with her, tucked into the pocket of her coat on the day she left. It was a letter she had found, half burned, in the fireplace of Dr. Harwell's consulting room on the estate, a letter she had come across while cleaning the grate during one of his visits, a letter she had picked up without quite knowing why, and put in her pocket, and then thought about constantly for weeks. The letter was in fragments, most of it was burned beyond reading. But she had been able to make out a street address in Lyon, France, and beneath it, in handwriting she had come to know well over 3 years of proximity, 2 words. Allara's handwriting. Allara's hand. In ink that was recent, not old. 2 words, barely legible through the char, please help. Agnes kept that fragment in a tin under her bed. She did not know what to do with it yet. She did not know who to trust with it. She only knew that she would not burn it. She had burned one letter already, and she would not burn another. She sat in her cottage in the evenings and she drank her tea and she thought about a young woman with a basket of flowers and a smile that nobody in that house deserved, and she waited. She was not sure what she was waiting for. But she believed, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has worked hard all her life, and therefore has a very low tolerance for things that are wrong, that whatever it was, it would come. She was going to be right about that. The leaves had been falling for 3 weeks by the time Edmund Ashford reappeared in London. He arrived on a grey Thursday in November with his personal secretary, 2 trunks of clothes, and the composed, slightly sorrowful expression of a man in dignified mourning, a man who had suffered a great loss but was, with admirable strength of character, beginning to rejoin the world. He took his usual rooms at his club. He had dinner with 3 men whose goodwill he needed. He attended a meeting of a committee at his club concerned with agricultural land management, about which he cared nothing, because it gave him an opportunity to be seen by the right people looking serious and responsible. Within 10 days, he had been seen at his club on 6 separate evenings. Within 3 weeks, the mourning period that polite society nominally expected of him had been, if not entirely completed, at least sufficiently performed. Edmund was not interested in performance for its own sake. He was interested in outcomes, and the outcome he required at present was access to Lady Constance Fairfax and her fortune. Constance Fairfax was 38 years old, widowed, and the possessor of an estate in Derbyshire and a financial portfolio that her late husband's solicitors estimated conservatively at somewhere in the neighborhood of £400,000. She was not beautiful in the way that drew immediate attention, but she was handsome in a way that wore well over time, composed, well-dressed, intelligent-looking. She had been widowed for 2 years and had spent those 2 years managing her own affairs with a competence that several men of her acquaintance found faintly threatening, which she had noticed and which she regarded with a dry amusement she did not often display in public. She had known Edmund Ashford slightly before his first marriage, and had formed the general impression that he was very presentable, very cold, and very careful. She had not pursued the acquaintance. She had other things to do. When his wife died and his name began appearing again on the social circuit with the specific visibility of a man positioning himself for a second marriage, Constance noticed, as she noticed most things, and reserved her judgment. She was introduced to him formally at a dinner at the home of mutual friends in December, 6 weeks after Edmund had returned to London. The dinner was excellent. The conversation was carefully arranged by their mutual friends in a way that seated Edmund and Constance near each other without making it obvious, and which gave them ample opportunity to talk. Edmund was very good at dinner conversation. He had spent 20 years cultivating the ability to appear warm and engaged while revealing nothing of substance, and the result was a social manner that many people found deeply attractive without being able to say exactly why. He asked Constance intelligent questions. He listened, or appeared to listen, to her answers. He was quietly self-deprecating about his estate management. He mentioned Allara once, briefly, with a restraint that could be read as grief too great to articulate, and then redirected the conversation so smoothly that Constance barely noticed the transition. After the dinner, sitting in her carriage on the way home, Constance thought about the evening with the careful, unhurried attention she gave to all things that required evaluation. Edmund Ashford had debts. This was not a secret. Nothing in their circle was truly a secret if you paid attention to the right things. His estate was large and the upkeep was enormous. He had not managed his finances particularly well in his younger years, and the Belmont money, which he had apparently not inherited on his wife's death, she had heard various accounts of the settlement arrangement, had left him no better off than before the marriage. He needed money. She had money. These were the basic facts. What Constance was considering was whether, setting aside the financial calculus, she found the prospect of Edmund Ashford bearable. She had not found her first marriage unbearable. She had found it manageable, which was a different thing. Her husband had been a decent man with a limited imagination, and a tendency to assume that Constance's intelligence was decorative rather than functional. She had managed him with the patient expertise of a woman who has learned to work within constraints, and when he had died, of a perfectly ordinary illness, honestly come by, she had mourned him genuinely and then, with equal genuineness, had found herself enormously relieved by the discovery that her own life was now entirely within her own control. She was not eager to give that up. Edmund Ashford, she thought, would be a challenging husband. He was too controlled, too deliberate. Men who were that controlled were usually concealing something. Then again, she thought, most men were concealing something. She arrived home, dismissed her maid for the evening, and sat in her study with a glass of wine and her accounts, which she found, as always, more satisfying than they were supposed to be. She reviewed the quarter's income, made several notes, and decided that she would accept Edmund's implied invitation to be courted, while reserving the right to change her mind at any point. She was a practical woman. Practicality, in her experience, was the most underrated quality in the world. Edmund's courtship proceeded over the following 3 months with the same methodical patience that characterized everything he did. He called at the appropriate times. He sent the appropriate gifts, flowers, books, nothing excessive. He attended events where he knew she would be and ensured that she saw him there. He wrote 2 letters, both perfectly judged in tone, attentive without being overwhelming, articulate without being ostentatious. The Belmont family watched all of this from a distance. George Belmont, still gray-faced and diminished by grief, received a single letter from Edmund's solicitor in January, informing him that the Duke intended to remarry in due course, and hoped that the Belmont family would extend their good wishes. The letter was legal, courteous, and as warm as a tax document. George read it and put it down and did not reply. Cesily read it over her father's shoulder and felt something sharpen in her chest. She had been continuing her investigations, quietly and methodically, through the winter months. She had written to several physicians, anonymously, asking academic questions about the typical progression of scarlet fever. She had written to a contact she had developed through a friend's connection, a woman journalist who worked for a progressive London paper and who had a reputation for asking inconvenient questions, and had had a long, careful conversation with her about what avenues of inquiry might be available. She had also written, in early January, to an address she had found through a circuitous chain of inquiries, a small bureau in Paris that, according to her journalist contact, specialized in tracing missing persons. The bureau was run by a man called Henri Blanc, who was discreet, expensive, and excellent at his work. Henri Blanc had written back within 2 weeks. He had, he said, received inquiries in the past regarding the Maison Sainte-Claire establishment in Lyon. He could say no more by letter, but if she wished to discuss the matter further, he would be available for a consultation at his Paris office. Cesily had read that letter 3 times. Then she had gone to her father and said, in the same calm, reasonable, entirely inflexible voice, "I need to go to Paris." George Belmont had looked at her with the exhausted eyes of a man who has lost one daughter and is not ready to let go of his grip on the other. "Cesily," he said. "I will be back within a fortnight," she said. "I am going to find out what happened to Allara." There was a long silence. "You think," her father began, and then stopped. Cesily waited. "I don't know what I think," George Belmont said quietly. "I only know that I do not feel at peace." "Neither do I," Cesily said, "so I am going to do something about it." She left for Paris on a Thursday morning in February, with a travel case, her notebook, and the absolute certainty of a woman who is about to pull on a thread that will unravel everything. In Lyon, in the Maison Sainte-Claire, the woman who had been called Madame Leclerc for the past 4 months sat in the walled garden and looked at the small, bare winter trees and tried, as she did every day, to hold herself together. Her name was not Madame Leclerc. She knew this with a certainty that the medicines had not entirely managed to erase, even at their strongest doses. They had blurred her, yes, blurred the edges of everything, made the world feel like something seen through thick glass, made time move strangely. In the first weeks, she had not been sure of anything. There had been days when she could not remember her own face, when the name they called her by had felt as true as anything else. But those days were passing. Slowly, unevenly, the blur was lifting. Her name was Allara. She was the wife of Edmund Ashford, who was the Duke of Windermere, and she had been placed in this establishment against her will, and no one had told her family where she was. She knew this the way she knew her own face in the mirror, the face that was thinner now, and paler, and had a look in its eyes that had not been there before. But it was her face, and she was Allara, and she had been alive for every single day of the past 4 months, in this quiet, well-run, polished place where she was treated with the impersonal kindness of people who are paid to ensure a problem does not make noise. She was making very little noise. She had learned, quickly, that making noise did not help, that asking questions drew attention, that attention meant increased medication, that increased medication meant more blurring, more lost days, more of that terrible thick glass feeling. So she was quiet. She was cooperative. She spoke pleasantly to the attendants. She ate her meals. She walked in the garden every day. And she thought about Cesily. She thought about Cesily the way a person stranded in a dark place thinks about light, not as something they are sure is coming, but as the thing they are most desperately holding on to. She thought about Cecily's letters, quick and funny and full of life. She thought about Cecily's voice on the last occasion they had seen each other in person, 6 months ago, laughing at something their father had said. She thought, Cesily will notice. She thought, Cesily will not accept it. She thought, if anyone in this world will come, it will be Cesily. She had no way to communicate this hope to anyone. She had no access to paper, to ink, to post. She had tried, in the first weeks, when she had been confused enough to make the mistake. She had asked an attendant for writing materials. The request had been refused, politely. She had managed to take a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil from a medical cabinet left briefly open and had written 2 words, "Please help," and had tucked the note inside a packet of letters addressed for post that had been left unattended for a few minutes on a table in the hallway. She did not know if the note had gone anywhere. She did not know if it had been found and removed before the post went out. She only knew that she had tried, and that trying was the only thing she had. She sat in the garden and looked at the bare winter trees and breathed the cold air and told herself, hold on. She told herself this every day. She did not know how many more days there would be. She did not know what Edmund intended to do with her eventually, whether this was meant to be permanent or whether he had some other plan she could not see. She only knew that every day she held on was a day closer to whatever came next. She told herself, Cesily is coming. She told herself this even on the days when she was least sure of it. She was right. Cesily Belmont arrived in Paris on a cold February afternoon and went directly from the station to the office of Henri Blanc on the Rue des Archives, where she was shown into a small, book-lined room and offered tea by a very efficient young woman, and where, 20 minutes later, Henri Blanc himself appeared. He was not what she had imagined. She had imagined someone dramatic, a theatrical figure with a cape and an air of mystery, the way investigators were sometimes described in the novels she had read. Henri Blanc was a small man in his 50s with a neat gray mustache, round glasses, and the mild, unhurried manner of a country doctor. He sat down across from her, folded his hands, and asked her, in excellent English, to tell him everything. She told him everything. She told him about the telegram, and the sealed casket, and the blocked letters, and the surgeon's certificate, and the detail about the fever that moved too fast, and the absence of any family access, and the letter she had received from Allara 11 days before her supposed death in which Allara had been perfectly well. She told him about her correspondence with the physicians, and what she had learned about the typical progression of the illness. She told him about Edmund's reappearance in London, and the news of a second engagement, and what that had felt like to read. She put her notebook on the table between them. Henri Blanc read through several pages of it with the attentive quiet of a man to whom details matter. Then he told her about the Maison Saint-Clair. It was a private establishment, he said, officially registered as a therapeutic rest facility for patients requiring extended care. In practice, and this he said carefully, with the restraint of a man who has learned to choose his words, it was known to him, through previous inquiries, as a place where persons of means arranged the quiet removal of inconvenient individuals from their lives. The patients were mostly women. They were well cared for physically. They were not imprisoned in any dramatic sense. They simply were not free to leave, and their correspondence was managed, and their families were not told where they were. Cesily listened to all of this without moving. When he finished, she said, "Has anyone there been recovered?" "A family member." "Has anyone been successfully retrieved?" Henri Blanc looked at her steadily. "3 times, he said, "in the last 7 years. With the right documentation, the right approach, and a sufficiently persuasive argument to the establishment's director, it has been done." "What kind of argument?" "The kind backed by legal documents and a sufficient sum of money," he said. "Tell me what I need." He told her. She wrote it all down. She left his office 2 hours later, walked down the Rue des Archives in the February cold, and stood on the pavement for a moment with the notebook clutched against her chest, and the gray Paris sky above her, and the specific feeling of a person who has just been told that the worst thing they suspected is true, and who is now running entirely on the fuel of the absolutely unbreakable determination to fix it. She had come here expecting to find out what had happened to Allara. She had found out. Now she had to go and get her back. She hailed a cab to her hotel, went to her room, sat down at the writing desk, and began to plan. She crossed into Lyon 4 days later, alone, with a false name on her travel documents, Miss Clara Wayne, a detail arranged through a quiet contact of Henri Blanc's, and a leather case containing a set of papers that Henri Blanc had helped her compile. A letter from a French solicitor confirming that a family claim was being processed through the consular system. A document stating that the patient held at Maison Saint-Clair under the name Madame Leclerc had been incorrectly registered and was the subject of an ongoing legal review. And a draft order signed by a sympathetic magistrate in Paris who had seen this kind of paperwork before and who had agreed, for reasons Henri Blanc did not explain and Cesily did not ask about, to sign it. She also carried, tucked into the inner lining of the case, £400 in cash. Henri Blanc had been specific about this, not for any illegal purpose, he had said with his careful mildness, simply for the administrative costs associated with expedited processing of unusual cases. The director of the Maison Saint-Clair was a man named Dr. Aurel Pont, who had the smooth manners of someone who has spent his career navigating situations that required extreme discretion. He received Cesily in his office, accepted her documents, read through them with the expression of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and who is calculating, as she watched, the specific ratio of legal risk to financial reimbursement. Cesily sat across from him and said nothing, and looked at him with the same calm, inflexible expression she had shown her father, and waited. Dr. Pont asked 2 questions. She answered both without hesitation, with the confidence of someone who has done her preparation. He asked for the administrative fee. She put the money on the desk. He picked up a pen and signed his name on the release form that she produced from the case. Then he pressed a bell and asked his assistant to bring Madame Leclerc to the south sitting room. Cesily stood in the south sitting room with her hands clasped together and her heart going at a speed that made her feel slightly unwell, and the door opened, and a woman came in who was thin and pale with short hair. They had cut her hair, which Cesily had not expected and which hit her like a blow, and who moved with a slight hesitation, the hesitation of a person who has been confined and medicated and is not entirely sure what is real. And then the woman turned her face toward the window, and Cecily's knees stopped working for a moment. She steadied herself with one hand on the back of a chair. "Allara," she said. The woman went very still. "Allara," Cesily said again. Her voice cracked on the second syllable, which was the only time in the entire preceding 6 months that she had allowed herself to crack. The woman turned fully toward her. And then Allara Ashford, who had been holding on for 4 months in the specific, exhausted, determined way of a woman who refuses to stop, looked at her sister across a small, quiet room in Lyon, France, and made a sound that was not a word, not quite a word, more like something that had been trapped inside her for a very long time, finally finding a way out. Cesily crossed the room in 3 steps and put her arms around her. She held on. They held on together. Outside the south sitting room window, the Lyon street was ordinary and noisy, and entirely indifferent to the fact that something enormous had just shifted. Carts rattled on the cobblestones. Someone was calling out prices at a market stall. A dog was barking at something down an alleyway. Inside the room, the 2 sisters stood together for a long time, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said right then, and because some moments are bigger than words. Eventually, Cesily pulled back and looked at her sister's face and said, in a voice that was much steadier than she felt, "I have a carriage outside. We are leaving now." Allara looked at her. Her eyes were clearer than they had been in months. Something was already coming back into them. Color, focus, the particular sharpness that Cesily had known all her life. "How?" Allara said. "Documents and money," Cesily said. "And about 6 months of not sleeping properly. Tell me later. Can you walk?" "Yes," Allara said. "Then we are going." They walked out of the Maison Sainte Claire through the front door in the middle of the afternoon, Cecily's hand on Allara's arm, into the pale Lyon winter light, and they got into the waiting carriage, and the driver urged the horses forward, and they were gone. They left Lyon on the evening train, sitting in a private compartment that Cesily had reserved and paid for in cash, the curtain drawn across the window, both of them wrapped in coats against the cold that came through the window seals. The train was warm enough once it got moving, but neither of them noticed the temperature very much. There were other things occupying their attention. Allara talked. She talked in fragments at first, not because she was confused, but because certain things were still tender, still difficult to touch directly. She talked about the early days in the sanatorium, the blurring, the lost time. She talked about the attendants and the garden and the bare winter trees she had been staring at for months. She talked about the note she had managed to write, and the uncertainty of not knowing whether it had reached anyone. The note had reached someone. Agnes Crane had the burned fragment in a tin under her bed. Cesily did not know this yet, but she would. She let Allara talk without interrupting. She held Allara's hand, which was thin and cold but steady. She listened with the same total attention she had given to Henri Blanc's information, to Dr. Pont's questions, to everything she had read in the past 6 months about how to do what she had just done. She listened the way she had always listened to Allara, as though every word mattered. And as Allara talked, she wrote things down. Not obviously. She had the notebook in her lap, half hidden under her coat, and she wrote with small, precise movements, capturing what Allara was saying in the shorthand she had developed over months of practice. Dates, names, specific details. The name of the medication Dr. Harwell had administered, which Allara had learned from a slip by one of the attendants. The name of the woman who had first told Allara she was registered as Madame Leclerc. The day, she remembered it clearly, when she had woken in the sanatorium for the first time and understood that she was not in England anymore. At some point after Dijon, Allara's voice slowed and then stopped, and Cesily looked over and found that her sister had fallen asleep, properly, deeply asleep, in the way of a person who has not slept without medication for a very long time, and is now, for the first time in months, safe enough to let go. Cesily put her notebook away. She sat in the moving dark of the train compartment and listened to the rhythm of the wheels on the rails and thought about what came next. She had her sister. She had the notebook, which now contained 4 months' worth of evidence, testimony, and carefully documented fact. She had the name of Dr. Harwell. She had the name of the Maison Sainte Claire. She had dates and doses and the name of the transport company that had moved Allara from England to France, which she had obtained from Henri Blanc. She had, in short, a case. What she needed now was what to do with it. She thought about this carefully, the way she thought about everything. The obvious answer was the law. The less obvious question was timing. Edmund, by the time she had left England, had announced an engagement to Lady Constance Fairfax. She had seen the announcement in the Times. The wedding was scheduled for mid-December. She looked at the dark window of the train and calculated. It was the first week of March. The wedding was roughly 9 months away. She had time. She also had a very clear idea. forming itself in her mind with the crystalline inevitability of something that has been building for a long time, of what she wanted to do with that time. She wanted to walk into that wedding, not out of dramatic impulse, out of something far more practical. If Edmund was publicly confronted, in front of 300 witnesses and a member of the clergy, with the fact that his wife was alive, he could not bury the story. He could not pay it off quietly. He could not manage it through solicitors and administrative fees. The press would be there. People whose silence could not be purchased would be there. The legal consequences would be immediate and unavoidable. She wanted Edmund Ashford to look up and see Allara standing in the nave of the church and to understand, in that single, public, catastrophic moment, that the walls he had built so carefully had all come down. She wanted everyone to see. The train went on through the French darkness, carrying two sisters north toward the coast, and Allara slept, and Cesily planned. She planned the way she always did everything, with complete, methodical, entirely implacable precision. She thought about who she would need. She thought about the legal angles. She thought about the press contact, the journalist friend who had helped her months ago, who would know exactly what to do with the story once it broke. She thought about the logistics of re-entry, of documentation, of the practical problem of presenting Allara, who was legally dead and would need to be legally undeadened before any court proceeding could go forward, to the relevant authorities. She thought about all of this for most of the night, while her sister slept, and when dawn came up gray and cold over the northern French countryside, she had a plan. A good plan. A thorough plan. And when the ferry crossed the channel in the gray morning light, with both of them on the deck with their faces into the wind, because Allara had wanted air, had wanted to stand in the wind over the water and feel it, and Cesily had understood this completely. Cesily allowed herself to feel, for the first time since the telegram, something very close to certainty. She watched England come up through the fog, the white cliffs slowly resolving from gray shapes into something solid and real. She had brought Allara home. Now she was going to burn Edmund Ashford to the ground, legally, publicly, completely, and with, she thought, impeccable timing. Edmund Ashford announced his engagement to Lady Constance Fairfax in the Times on a bright Thursday in September, and it was everything he had planned it to be. A short, dignified notice, impeccably worded, accompanied by the quiet social circulation of information that such things required in his world. The engagement was welcomed by exactly the people whose welcome mattered to him. Lady Constance was congratulated by friends who told her, with varying degrees of sincerity, that they were delighted. Constance accepted the congratulations with her customary composure. She had accepted Edmund's proposal 6 weeks earlier, after a courtship she had found, on reflection, satisfactory in its management, if not particularly warm in its feeling. She had conditions. Her solicitor had made sure of that. Her fortune would remain under her own trustees. Her estate in Derbyshire was hers. The marriage settlement was considerably more favorable to her than Edmund's solicitor had initially proposed, and had been revised twice in her direction before she was satisfied. She was not foolish. She knew what Edmund needed. She was not indifferent to this, but she was not destabilized by it either. She needed a husband of the right kind, socially, not emotionally, and Edmund, whatever his particular temperature, was unquestionably the right kind. They would manage each other. She had managed a great deal in her life. What she did not know was that Cecily Belmont had been in England since March and had spent the intervening months doing 6 very specific things. She had engaged a barrister, a sharp, experienced man named Geoffrey Ford, who had a reputation for taking cases that other barristers thought impossible and extracting improbable results from them through sheer preparation and an absolute refusal to be shaken. She had found Geoffrey through the journalist contact, who knew everyone. Geoffrey had listened to everything Cecily had to say, read the notebook from cover to cover, and told her that she had one of the best documented cases of wrongful imprisonment and fraudulent death certification he had seen in 30 years of practice. He had not said this enthusiastically. He had said it the way he said everything, steadily, factually, without decoration. He had also said, "You understand that this will be a significant public event." "Yes," Cecily had said. "And you are prepared for that?" "We are prepared for that," Cecily had said, with a precision in the pronoun that Geoffrey had noted. She had also made contact with Agnes Crane, through a careful, quiet process that had taken 3 weeks and resulted in a meeting at Agnes's cottage, at which Agnes had sat across from Cecily, and looked at her for a long moment, and then reached under her bed and produced a tin. Cecily had looked at the burned fragment of letter. She had read the 2 words. She had looked up at Agnes with an expression that was not surprise. She had been beyond surprise for some months. but something closer to the specific feeling of a puzzle piece going precisely where it belongs. "You kept it," she said. "Of course I kept it," Agnes said, with the tone of a woman who has been waiting for this conversation for a considerable amount of time. Agnes had agreed to testify. She had done this without hesitation, with a firmness that Geoffrey Ford, when he met her, privately concluded was worth more than any document he had seen. She knew where every body was buried, figuratively speaking, every detail of the 8 days of Allara's supposed illness, every blocked letter, every closed door, every specific arrangement that had been made for the management of the Duchess. She remembered it all, because she was Agnes Crane, and Agnes Crane had a memory like a well-organized archive and a moral compass that had not deviated 1 degree in 60 years. Cesily had also spoken to the village physician, to one of the footmen who had left the Ashford estate shortly after the funeral, and who had been, it turned out, deeply unsettled by what he had witnessed, and who now found that his conscience was considerably relieved by the opportunity to tell someone, and to a second physician in Cheltenham who had, at Cecily's request, examined Allara, and produced a detailed written assessment of her condition and its likely causes. The legal proceedings had been initiated quietly, in chambers, through Geoffrey Ford's connections and the mountain of documentation Cesily had compiled. The court had formally recognized that no death had occurred. The false certificate had been identified, flagged, and was the subject of a separate proceeding against Dr. Harwell, who had been served with the relevant papers on a Tuesday morning, and who had, Cecily's legal contact reported, turned an interesting shade of gray upon receiving them. Allara had been living, since her return from France, at the Belmont family home in Wiltshire, under the care of a physician whom her father had selected, and under the daily attention of her mother, who had wept with such thoroughness upon Allara's return that she had been briefly worried about her health. Allara had spent the months since Lyon rebuilding herself, eating properly, sleeping properly, walking in the Belmont gardens, writing in a journal that she kept locked, talking with Cesily in the long evenings about everything and nothing, slowly reacquiring the self that had been blurred and muffled and managed for 4 months. She was, by September, very nearly herself. She was thin still, and there were shadows under her eyes that had not been there before, and she was quieter than she had been, with an occasional stillness about her that was new. But the spine was there, the chin was up, the eyes were clear. She had agreed to Cecily's plan. She had agreed to it not because Cecily had pushed her. Cecily would not have pushed, would have accepted whatever Allara decided, but because she had thought about it carefully over several weeks and had arrived at the same conclusion by her own route. Edmund had taken 4 months of her life. He had taken her identity. He had taken her health and her freedom and her sense of safety. He had filed papers saying she was dead and had moved forward into a new life with the smooth efficiency of a man disposing of a problem. She wanted him to face what he had done. She wanted it to happen in a room full of witnesses. She wanted there to be no managing it afterward, no quiet settlement, no paid silence. She wanted the truth to be so public and so complete that there was nothing left of his careful construction but rubble. She had told Cecily all of this, calmly, over tea, on a Tuesday evening. Cecily had looked at her across the table and said, "Right, then we need to be in London by the 14th of December. The wedding of the Duke of Windermere to Lady Constance Fairfax was scheduled for the 15th. The 15th of December was a cold, still morning, the kind that comes in English winter when the frost is hard and the light is thin and silver and everything is quiet in a way that feels like the world is waiting for something. St. George's Church in Hanover Square was one of London's great society venues, and it had been dressed for the occasion with the thoroughness that a duke's second wedding merited. White flowers banked along the pews, candles burning in the sconces, the smell of beeswax and cold stone and roses so thick in the air that it was almost physical. 300 guests filed in over the course of the morning, filling the nave with the rustle of silk and the murmur of people who are pleased to be seen in a place like this, on a day like this. Edmund arrived at 10 o'clock. He stood at the altar with his best man, a cousin, a quiet man who had always done what Edmund required of him without question, and he looked out over the assembled guests and felt something that might, in another man, have been described as satisfaction. He had done it. He had managed the situation with Allara, had managed the subsequent months, had managed Constance and the engagement and the legal arrangements, and the social presentation of himself as a man of good standing who had suffered a loss, and was, with appropriate dignity, rebuilding his life. He had done all of it correctly. He had not made errors. He was about to be married to £400,000. The organ began. The great doors at the back of the nave opened. Lady Constance appeared at the far end of the aisle in ivory silk, flanked by her brother who was giving her away, and Edmund watched her begin the long walk toward him with the specific patience of a man who has come to the end of a long process and is waiting for the final step. Nobody noticed the side door. It was a small door, set into the south wall of the transept, the kind of door that was normally used by vergers and clergy moving between the vestry and the nave. It opened quietly, about 15 seconds after the main doors opened. The hinges were well oiled. It made very little sound. 2 women came through it. The first was slight and dark-haired and wore a traveling coat. She moved with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of someone who has planned exactly this moment for 9 months and is now executing it with complete composure. The second woman was thin, with hair cut shorter than it had been in the last photograph her family possessed of her, and she wore a coat that was clean but plain, and she walked with a steadiness that cost her something, not in courage, of which she had more than she needed, but in the accumulated weight of what she was about to do. They walked together through the transept and into the south side of the nave, and nobody saw them at first, because 300 pairs of eyes were watching Lady Constance move up the aisle in ivory silk. But the nave of St. George's is a space that carries sound with extraordinary efficiency. Its stone walls and vaulted ceiling amplify even quiet voices and send them into every corner. And the voice that spoke next was not quiet. It was clear and steady, and it carried to every stone, every rafter, every candle flame in the building. I object. The organ played 2 more notes and then stopped. 300 heads turned. Lady Constance stopped walking. Edmund turned. Later, the guests who described this moment would use different words for what they saw on Edmund Ashford's face. Some said he went pale. Some said he seemed to diminish, physically, as though something vital had been removed from him in an instant. One man, positioned close to the altar, said he saw Edmund's hand grip the altar rail, just once, and then release it. What all of them agreed on was this. He looked at the woman standing in the south transept, and he knew. He knew immediately. There was no delay, no confusion, no moment of uncomprehending stare. His face showed, in the space of 2 seconds, the complete and rapid collapse of every wall he had built over the past 14 months. Lady Constance's bouquet hit the stone floor. She did not stoop to pick it up. The chaplain stepped backward and knocked over a candlestick, which clattered with a sound that was enormous in the silence. And then several things happened at once. Cesily Belmont walked forward from the transept into the nave, holding a notebook. Behind her, 2 constables, arranged for, planned for, expected by everyone in this picture except Edmund and his cousin and Lady Constance and 300 guests, entered through the same side door. Geoffrey Ford, who had been sitting in the 3rd pew on the south side as a member of the public in a church, which anyone was entitled to be, rose from his seat. Allara Ashford, the Duchess of Windermere, who had been declared dead and buried in an empty casket 4 months after Edmund had decided she was no longer useful to him, stood in the nave of St. George's Church in Hanover Square, in front of 300 people, and the full apparatus of a society occasion, and looked at her husband across the length of a church that smelled of roses and beeswax. Edmund looked back at her. He did not run. He had nowhere to run to. He simply stood at the altar rail with his pale gray eyes fixed on her face, and in those eyes, every person who was close enough to see them would later say, you could read it. Not guilt, exactly. Edmund Ashford was not a man built for the expression of guilt, but something. The specific expression of a man watching something he built with extreme care and considerable patience fall completely apart. The constables moved forward. Geoffrey Ford, C.